Imagine being 7 years old and waking to the sound of your father screaming. Not shouting, screaming like a wounded animal being dragged across splintered floorboards. Imagine pressing your face against the cracks in a wooden wall as men, with boots and torches, pull him from your home because he hesitated to bow, because he looked a white man in the eye, because he had pride. Josiah remembered how the torchlight lit his father's face in flashes. Rage, then confusion, then something like acceptance. They didn't let him say goodbye. They just took him. That night, the sky cracked with thunder, and the rain came down hard, but the screaming never really stopped. It echoed across the quarters like a warning. At dawn, Josiah followed the sound of silence, past the fields, past the coops, past old Hannah's shack with the broken door. He found his father hanging from a crooked cypress tree by the edge of the swamp, his bare feet caked in mud, his eyes open to a sky that never blinked. Crows circled overhead, one perched on his shoulder like it had been waiting all night. They didn't let Lottie, Josiah's mother, cut him down. They said the underscore died with pride. Let him rot with it. A field hand did it in secret at dusk, burying the body in a hole too shallow for peace. Josiah helped pack the dirt one handful at a time, arms trembling, face blank. Lottie didn't speak after that. Not a word, not a whisper. Once the most spirited woman on the plantation, a midwife, a singer, a mother of 3 before death took the others. She became a ghost in a linen dress. She spent her days scrubbing floors that weren't dirty, polishing iron that didn't shine, folding rags into neat squares, and unfolding them again. Her eyes stopped seeing people. She drifted like ash from one task to another. Her body was there, but hollowed from the inside. Josiah tried to talk to her. He brought mint leaves for tea, sugar cubes he'd stolen from the big house. A polished stone shaped like a heart. She never looked at him. She just hummed an old spiritual under her breath, a melody that sounded more like a moan. He'd sit beside her at night, arms around his knees, hoping for the warmth of her voice, hoping for a word, just one. Then came the night. The master's eldest son, a pale, heavy man named Charles, with the breath of rotting peaches. He entered their cabin after dark. Josiah lay curled in the corner on a rag-stuffed mat, pretending to sleep. He watched from behind a sheet as Charles stood over his mother, said nothing, just reached out and grabbed her wrist. Lottie didn't fight. She didn't scream. She rose, like someone answering a chore, and followed him out, her feet dragging on the dirt floor. That was the last sound Josiah heard before the door closed. He stayed awake all night. His heart beat so hard, he thought it might crack a rib. She returned before dawn, her dress torn at the neckline, dried blood on her thigh, and a single twig caught in her hair. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at nothing. That morning, she washed the blood from her legs at the pump, while a bird sang in the trees. Josiah watched her from a distance, clutching the stone hark in his fist until his knuckles bled. The following weeks were quiet, too quiet. Lottie stopped folding rags. She stopped humming. Her hands shook when she held anything. Once, Josiah reached to touch her cheek. She flinched like he'd struck her. 3 months later, on a gray morning heavy with fog, she tied a faded red scarf around her head the same one she wore on her wedding day. She walked barefoot toward the river. She didn't pack anything, didn't leave a note. She kissed Josiah's forehead for the first time in months. And in a voice so soft, it sounded like wind, she whispered, "I'm going to wash the blood out." Josiah followed her halfway. He stopped when she reached the water's edge. He watched her step into the river slowly, like she was walking into church. When the water reached her shoulders, she looked back once, not at him, but at the sky, then let herself sink. She never came back. The overseers said she'd gone mad, just like her man. A weak kind of slave, they said. Better off gone. But Josiah knew better. He'd seen madness before. This wasn't madness. This was what's left when the world takes everything, her man, her dignity, her voice, and leaves only pain. Josiah sat by the river until nightfall, staring at the place where the water swallowed her. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. When he returned to the quarters, he looked 10 years older. Something had changed behind his eyes. Not broken, not shattered, closed. From that day forward, he stopped asking questions, stopped waiting for kindness. He worked silently, kept to the edges of the world, watching, absorbing. And in the stillness of the kitchen, in the scent of grease and ash, a hunger began to rise inside him. Not for food, not for comfort, but for balance. And one day, that hunger would be fed. At age 10, Josiah was reassigned to the kitchen, not as punishment, but because he didn't fit in the fields. The overseers called him unnerving. He didn't speak much, didn't cry when he was whipped, didn't beg when they withheld food. He just stared cold, patient. There was something about the way he looked at people that made even grown men shift in their boots. He was small for his age, wiry, fast-moving, the kind of child that slipped into rooms unnoticed and left without a sound. They said he didn't smile, not even as a baby. After his mother walked into the river, he became even quieter. He ate when told, slept when told. But his eyes, those eyes, moved constantly, as if taking notes on the world and storing them in a place no one could reach. The kitchen was ruled by old Mabel, a big-boned woman with skin like dark velvet and fingers thick with calluses. She had been the estate cook for over 30 years. No one dared cross her, not even the mistress. Her food kept the big house warm and well-fed, and in the South, that meant power. She ran the kitchen like a ship, with rules, knives, and fire. To Josiah, she became something like a shadow mother. At first, Mabel didn't speak much to him. She didn't have to. She'd slap a chicken on the table and say, "Gut." If he hesitated, she'd slap his wrist. Not like that. Like this. She showed him how to break the neck in one motion. No screaming. How to peel the skin like a glove. How to save every part: liver, heart, fat. Waste was a sin in the kitchen. By the time Josiah turned 11, he could gut a chicken in 20 seconds and have the bones boiling by 30. He learned to butcher pigs, stretch ox hide, smoke meat over sweetwood until the skin crisped like paper. He stirred pots taller than him, learned to read boiling water like language. Watched Mabel season everything with instinct. No measuring spoons, just memory. She showed him how to balance flavors, how bitter could turn sweet with molasses, how spoiled meat could be masked with vinegar and spice, how to make bread without yeast, stew without salt, soup thick enough to fool any master into thinking he was full. "I'd love what fools them," she muttered once. Josiah never forgot that. Still, he didn't speak much. He answered with nods, obeyed without sound. But his eyes never stopped moving. He watched Mabel's hands, watched the guests with greedy tongues and filthy boots, watched how they ate, how they chewed, how they wiped their mouths like kings. And he remembered. By 15, Josiah could cut a hog blindfolded. He could prepare a meal for 40, still have coals lit before sunrise. He worked without rest, never complained, never raised his voice. The mistress loved him for that, said he had a quiet spirit. The master called him Golden Hands. Guests praised his food in drunken rants, said he must have been touched by God. Some asked if he could be loaned to neighboring plantations for special dinners. Josiah just bowed and said, "Yes, sir," or "No." But in his mind, he was building a library, a thick, secret ledger of everything they said, everything they ate, everything that made them weak. He remembered who had ulcers, who always reached for cream, who couldn't handle garlic, who left groaning. He filed it all away, like recipes. Because Josiah wasn't cooking for praise. He was cooking for knowledge. He wasn't stirring to please. He was preparing. What the white folks mistook for obedience was actually surveillance. What they thought was humility was silence made of sharpened edges. Sometimes at night, when the fire burned low and Mabel slept on her stool with a rag on her face, Josiah would experiment. He'd crush leaves into paste, mix them with lard, melt herbs into oils, dry seeds until they cracked, taste their bitterness, just enough to know the sting. He'd cook tiny meals in clay bowls, adding, subtracting, adjusting. He wasn't trying to poison. Not yet. He was trying to understand how people could die from flavor. At 17, he witnessed a guest from Charleston choke violently after eating shrimp and garlic butter. The man's throat swelled like a hog bladder. He collapsed under the table, frothing. They said it was an allergic reaction. Josiah stared at the half-eaten plate, thought, so garlic can be a blade. That night, he began writing combinations. In his mind, sweet plus root oil equals vomiting. Shellfish plus wine equals swelling. Certain seeds equal blood thinning. A new language. A deadly one. I-20. Josiah had taken over most of the kitchen. Mabel was too old. Her hands slow. Her eyes cloudy. She trusted him completely. He cooked everything. For the master, the guests, even the pastor. Josiah's reputation stretched far beyond the estate. They talked about that slave boy with golden hands, joked he could make ark taste good. Some said he was God's own cook. But Josiah didn't believe in God. Not anymore. Not after his father. Not after his mother. Not after watching people treated like dogs while the masters feasted. What Josiah believed in was balance. And in the slow, deliberate way justice could be served hot. There were days he'd look around a big house dining room, study the faces of those seated at the long table, laughing with full mouths, wiping grease from their lips, complimenting him without meeting his eyes. He'd stand in the doorway and say, "Yes, sir," or "More tea." while quietly noting their skin, dry, swollen, red. Was their stomach unsettled? Were they tired afterward? Each plate a test, each body a subject. But he waited. Years. He waited, because revenge wasn't something to throw like a stone. It was a dish, and Josiah was learning how to cook it just right, slowly, without smoke, without suspicion. And behind the quiet, behind every "yes, massa," behind every roasted chicken and buttery pie, behind every biscuit on a gold-rimmed plate, something had taken root inside Josiah. And it wasn't rage. Not the kind of hunger that screamed. This was deeper. Not for food, he'd never cared for taste. Not for praise, he hated their compliments. This was hunger for control, for order, for a world that paid for what it had. Taken from his mother's body, from his father's pride, from his own quiet soul. And when that hunger finally matured, he'd feed it slowly, bite by bite. The first course was a man named Mr. Thaddeus Cullen, a cousin from Charleston. He'd visit every few months uninvited, but always welcomed. He was the sort of white man people whispered about behind closed doors. Loud, drunk, grabbing things that weren't his. His boots tracked in shame. His laugh echoed like a crow's cry. When he drank, which was often, he told wild tales at New Orleans. The overseers smirked. The women tensed. The slaves looked away. Cullen was a predator in silk. He wore gold-buttoned coats and called the cooks his little flavors. He'd tousle the girls' hair like pets and joke about them seasoning his bed. Josiah had watched him for years, saw the bruises he left, heard the muffled crying behind pantry doors. Nothing ever happened to him. The master once brushed off a complaint, saying, "Boys will be boys," like flicking a fly from his wine dot. By the time Cullen showed up that spring, Josiah had been testing his mixtures in secret for over a year. Not to kill, just to learn. What made a man dizzy? What caused sickness without fever? What simmered inside a stomach without boiling over? He studied like a scientist, burying failures behind the smokehouse. Now Cullen had returned sloppier, louder, needier. That afternoon, he ordered lamb stew, fatty and rich, just how he liked it. Josiah made it carefully: garlic, cloves, honey-roasted yams, and a powder ground fresh that morning from dried pods crushed with a mallet. Bitter on its own, but invisible in stew thick with fat and cinnamon dot. It wasn't poison, not really. A blend had turned a body against itself. The right amount brought pain and vomiting and silence. At dinner, Cullen licked his fingers like a dog. "Best damn stew I've had in years," he said. He laughed at Josiah, called him "my golden," and patted his cheek. Josiah stood still. No blink, no flinch. Just bowed and stepped back. The screaming started after midnight. Wet, guttural, like something trying to escape his insides. The household stirred. Candles lit. The master cursed. They found Cullen collapsed, sweating, vomiting dark sludge onto the rub. His eyes bulged, his gut spasmed. He begged for water, then whiskey, then God. No one knew what to do. The doctor arrived before dawn, reeking of liquor. He sniffed vomit, bad whiskey, he mumbled. Charleston road'll kill a man quicker than war. They laid Cullen in med. By then, his breathing was shallow, lips blue. He died as the sun rose, mouth crooked like he'd been caught mid-dash, choked out. The house went still. They dressed his body, and mistress wept as they loaded him into the cart. She laid a white rose on his chest and whispered, "At least he had a meal. He loved." Josiah watched the cart vanish into the trees. No blink, no sigh, but deep in his hollow chest, where grief once lived, something felt full. That night, Josiah sat by the fire alone. He didn't think of measurements or ingredients. He listened to his heartbeat slow, steady, like footsteps in dirt. He hadn't done it in anger. He'd planned. He'd executed. No one suspected him. Satisfaction didn't roar. It settled like a broth, slow and warm. Days passed. Josiah moved like clockwork. Served tea, baked bread, cleaned the butcher's table. Nothing changed. No one looked at him differently. Whispers of Cullen's death spread. Some called it a curse. Others blamed the whiskey. No one blamed the cook. They never did. That's when Josiah understood. Food was invisible. People trusted what fed them. If it tasted good, it couldn't be bad. And if it came from black hands, it was even easier to ignore. To them, he was talent, not threat. Decoration, not danger. That meant power. Quiet, complete power in every pot, roast, and plate, delivered with a bow. After Cullen, Josiah moved differently. Not arrogant, intentional. He noted every guest, every insult, every subtle cruelty. He tracked preferences. Who liked spice? Who asked for extra butter? Who avoided beans? Who licked plates clean? He didn't want to kill randomly. That was noise. And Josiah hated noise. What he craved was precision. One bite at a time. No blood. No suspicion. Just death whispered into their systems like prayer. He wasn't just a cook anymore. He was composer, surgeon, god of the kitchen. One night, as he scrubbed copper pans, old half-blind Mabel passed by. She paused, tilted her head like she was reading his shape. "You cookin' different these days," she said. Josiah didn't turn, just wipe the pan again. "Just refining the flavor," he said. Mabel stared a moment longer, then walked off. She never asked again. That spring, more guests came. Dinners grew grander. The master beamed with pride. And Josiah, quiet, precise, stood at the center of it all, seasoning each dish with something nearing divinity. But underneath, deeper than ash or apron, something else stirred. Not just hunger, not vengeance, confidence, the kind that comes after a first kill, the kind that sharpens a man. By the anniversary of Cullen's death, Josiah had evolved, not just a cook, but a craftsman of quiet death. What began as release had become ritual, art. Each morning, he moved like a priest, slicing, stirring, kneading. But beneath the ritual, a second layer simmered, one no one could see. He wasn't just feeding mouths. He was studying, calculating, perfecting. Justice, he learned, didn't need flames. It needed control, doses, bitterness beneath sweetness. At night, he fed scraps laced with powders to stray dogs behind the smokehouse. They were his test subjects, early tasters. He watched which ones staggered, vomited, went still. He remembered everything. No notes, no paper, memory only. He trusted nothing else. He found an unlikely assistant in Sarah Bith, a curious girl of 12. She thought he was teaching medicine, tinctures, poultices, healing teas. He never corrected her. She ground herbs into powder, thinking it was for fevers. In truth, it was death in disguise. One day, she asked, "Uncle Joe, what's this one for?" "Helps folks sleep," he said. "You gonna give it to the missus? She never sleeps." His knife paused mid-slice. He looked at her innocence and smiled faintly. Maybe one day. She giggled and went back to work. She didn't understand what she was helping build. She didn't need to. Josiah's poisons weren't flashy. No frothing, no convulsing. Just familiar southern symptoms: heat stroke, typhoid, fatigue. A man could feast on pork Sunday, walk Monday, die Thursday. The doctor would call it bad luck. They always did. Josiah's first real target was Benton Graves, a merchant who treated children like livestock. Josiah served him pork belly in plum glaze with a whisper of his bitter blend. Graves died 4 days later, bleeding, blind in one eye. The doctor blames Charleston meat. Josiah served soup at the wake. Next was Reverend Fielding, who preached gratitude from the pulpit and raped behind barns. Josiah gave him sweet potato pie, laced with something new. Fever, tremors, delirium. He died a week later. Cause of death: summer fever. Josiah baked biscuits for the funeral. Then came Langdor, the drunk who called slaves furniture. Josiah fed him okra stew with crab. By dawn, he was convulsing. By noon, dead. No one mourned him. No one suspected Josiah. That was his gift, his invisibility. They never saw him as clever or careful, just useful. And that made them weak. He always showed up when they fell ill, gentle, present, bringing broth, mopping brows, whispering comfort. They trusted him, even as they withered. Josiah watched, not with pity, but study. Watched their bodies fail. Watched them suffer the way his mother had. And when they were finally still, he'd exhale, chest loosened. Only then could he sleep. Some nights he sat barefoot by dying embers. He didn't pray. He didn't speak. He just listened. To frogs, to wind, to silence. The world after a death was quieter, sharper, more honest. No one ever questioned the coincidence of the illnesses. No one connected the dots between the guests who once sneered at the sleighs and their sudden decline. Death was ordinary in the South. Fevers swept through like tempests. The heat claimed more lives than Lolits. The South devours its own, the master once said, after a neighbor collapsed in his garden from heat stroke. And Josiah had become the weather. He kept no trophies, no journals, only memory. He never killed in rage. He killed with precision. When he passed by the graves of those he'd taken, he didn't grin. He didn't gloat. He simply acknowledged them, ingredients in a dish still cooking. A long overdue settling of the scales. And though he never spoke it aloud, a truth simmered. Inside him, every death was a hymn, a note in a melody only he could hear, a song for his father, strung like meat from a tree, a song for his mother, claimed by the river, a song for every scream that had never been allowed to escape. And Josiah, the quiet kitchen boy, the one who never smiled, never cried, who spoke softer than smoke, had become the composer of their requiem. One bite at a time. Behind the smokehouse, past the pig pens and sagging fences no one ever fixed, The woods thickened into a forgotten corner of the Middleton land. The trees there were old, gnarled like clenched fists. The ground stayed wet, year-round. That's where Josiah buried his early work. The stray cats, dogs, rats, and possums he tested his first mixtures on. A quiet graveyard of failed recipes and learned lessons, stitched into the soil like pages of a book no one would ever read. But dirt doesn't keep secrets forever. One humid June afternoon, with cicadas screaming like sirens and the sun nailed in the sky, a scruffy mongrel wandered in from a neighboring field. It began digging near the chicken coop, sniffing, pawing obsessively at the damp earth. At first, the nearby children laughed, until the dog unearthed something pale, something small, a human jawbone, tiny. Panic swept the slave quarters like wildfire. Some said it belonged to a runaway child sold long ago. Others whispered of a baby born dead and buried in secret. But most voices settled on one name, Josiah. They remembered how he lingered behind the smokehouse, how he boiled strange things in clay pots long after the kitchen closed, how the meat sometimes smelled wrong, though the white folks never noticed. A few claimed they saw him talking to bones, arranging them like puzzles before trimming them to ash. The field hands grew uneasy. Some turned their backs when he passed. Others left herbs or nails at their doors, crude charms to ward off spirits. He anxious cooking, rasped old Nettie, her voice like dried corn husk. She'd outlived 2 husbands in one eye, spent her days on the porch shelling peas, muttering to herself. But that night, she spoke clearly, he remembering every cut, every name, that boy cooking ghosts into the meals. Children were warned to avoid Josiah, even the bold ones. The boys who used to sneak into the smokehouse for scraps began giving the kitchen a wide berth. But Josiah said nothing, did nothing, just kept cooking silent, precise, unchanged. Still, the unease thickened. Mr. Platt, the overseer, had never trusted Josiah, didn't like how the boy never looked afraid, how he worked too clean, too calm. In Platt's mind, a slave was supposed to sweat, roan, and whimper, but Josiah never made a sound. He only watched, and that made Platt nervous. When the jawbone surfaced, Platt turned his attention fully on him. He lingered near the kitchen, stepped into the smokehouse unannounced, asking questions. How long the meat had been curing, what was in the rub, why that fire pit burned so late. Josiah answered in calm tones, respectful, vague. Platt found nothing, and that only enraged him further. He began blaming Josiah for spoiled meat, missing knives, a guest's sudden illness. Josiah never protested. He just nodded and fixed what was broken. But something behind his eyes had shifted, a glint of resolve, a stillness of a knife before the cut. And one afternoon, Platt went too far. A young boy, Elijah no older than 11, collapsed in the field from heat stroke. He'd been coughing since morning, pale and swaying, but Platt refused to let him rest. When the boy finally crumpled, Platt dragged him behind the barn and beat him until his back split open. When the switch snapped, he used his fists. By the time he stopped, Elijah was barely breathing, ribs cracked, one arm bent wrong. Josiah saw it from the kitchen window. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. That night, he made pork roast with a sorghum glaze, lined with rosemary. thick cornbread soaked in buttermilk. He brought a full plate to Platt himself. Hands steady. Eyes down. "You eat yet?" Platt mumbled, already chewing. "No, sir," Josiah said. "Not yet." "Damn shame," Platt grunted, cramming in another bite. Josiah returned to the kitchen, washed his hands twice, and went to bed early. 3 days later, Platt woke coughing blood. By noon, he couldn't stand. By night, he was writhing in his bunk, lungs drowning. The doctor called it lung rot. The master ordered him buried before sunrise. No sermon. No farewell. Josiah served bacon and corngrits the next morning. No one said a word, but the slaves knew. They didn't voice it. But fear turned into something else. Awe. Women began leaving sage and tobacco at Josiah's door. Knock warnings. Offerings. A quiet reverence gathered around him. He had become more than a cook. He had become a force. Not vengeance, balance, only. Old Nettie dared say it plain. "He ain't like us no more. That boy done crossed over. He feeding something bigger now." Yet Josiah remained unchanged on the surface. Still stirred with the same rhythm. Still chopped with the same grace. Still answered every man with "Yes, sir." But inside, a ledger grew. Every cruelty, every insult, every bruise he witnessed and could not prevent, they became ingredients. Waiting. He didn't act out of rage. He acted from memory. Each death was not revenge. It was a completed recipe. And now even the soil whispered his name. The visitor arrived on a warm Tuesday in mid-October. City shoes. Northern curiosity. His name was Mr. Horace Lyle, a journalist. From Philadelphia, with a sharp chin and sharper questions. He was writing a piece titled "The Southern Soul." Hospitality, industry, and the grace of the gentleman. The Middletons treated him like royalty. The master poured bourbon like water. The mistress laid fresh linens. Even the dogs were scrubbed. The slaves were warned. Smile. Move fast. Speak only when asked. The plantation was to appear heavenly. The truth stayed buried like the bones behind the smokehouse. Lyle was polite, but observant. Always watching, always scribbling. He asked about yield, structure, slave contentment. He smiled often, but his eyes never rested. Even Josiah noticed the way Lyle lingered at the kitchen door. The way he watched who flinched, who bowed too low. That night, the master demanded a feast worthy of history. Josiah delivered. No rush, no panic. Just the same steady flow. The main course, duck breast, seared in brown butter and thyme. Finished with molasses and fire cider, wild greens. Cornbread dripping in lard and honey. For dessert, apple slices, poached in spiced syrup. Josiah served every plate himself. One by one. He did not poison it. Not truly. Not this time. But he added something. A refined oil, drawn from the pit of a particular seed. Nearly tasteless, but potent enough to twist the gut. Not fatal, just a reminder. Lyle savored every bite. Complimented the duck 3 times. Asked if Josiah had ever cooked in Charleston. Josiah replied only once, "No, sir." Then vanished. That night, past 2 a.m., Lyle woke retching, skin pale, guts churning. He staggered into the hall, mumbling for water. The mistress found him collapsed against the wall, whispering. It was the food. It was the food. He refused the doctor. Demanded to leave. "Something's wrong here," he said, clutching his coat. "The air's too still." By dawn, he was gone. A week later, his article appeared up north. The title read, "Where the Magnolia Wilts." A visit to Middleton Plantation. It started with praise columns, fresh bread, shining floors. But then, "There is something here I cannot name. The food is divine, the servants polite. Yet I felt as if I were eating in a house built atop a grave. There is silence here, not peace, but a hush, as if something is being hidden just beneath the skin." The master read it in his study, jaw tight. Called Lyle a liar. The mistress lit candles, whispered prayers into the rafters, earned Nettie's herbs, slept with a Bible beneath her pillow. The master kept a pistol under his bed, but they kept asking Josiah to cook. Always, his meals were too perfect, his silence too soothing. They mistook his calm for loyalty. Many had made that mistake. Many did not live to correct it. They never asked how Josiah knew to pair duck fat with vinegar syrup. Never asked how he kept meat fresh, without salt, through the worst summer heat. No one questioned how he pulled bread from the oven just before it burned, or why his hands never shook, not even while holding blades. They didn't know about the wall behind the pantry door, hidden behind ladles and sacks of dried beans. Only Josiah knew how to shift the backboard. Only he knew the jagged charcoal lines in the wood, names carved one by one. Some had dates. Some just had symbols: a crooked cross, a circle. There were 29 names when Lyle came. People who died, disappeared, or wasted away mysteriously since Josiah had started cooking on his own. Most of them white. Most of them cruel. All of them, in his eyes, deserving. Sometimes Josiah would run his fingers over the names, not as a ritual, but as a reminder. A list not of victims, but of lessons. Some deaths were too quick. Some took too long. Some stirred suspicion. Others vanished like sugar in tea. He learned from each one. And now, he had a new name to add. Lyle hadn't died, but he'd come close. More importantly, he had spoken. Written. Published. He had felt something. Even if he couldn't name it, it mattered. It was a start. A spark beneath the magnolia. Leaves out in the days that followed. The house grew quieter, not in duty, but in spirit. The same meals were served. The same cotton picked. But the laughter at the table turned hollow. The master drank more. The mistress prayed longer. Guests began to decline invitations. The reputation of Middleton shifted from respect to something closer to fear. But in the kitchen, Josiah remained unchanged. He stirred with care. He cut with precision. He answered every call. Behind his eyes, there was no storm. Only still. Water cold, reflective, deep enough to drown in. Because Josiah understood now what few ever do. Real power doesn't shout. It doesn't snarl. It moves unseen like heat in a stew, like poison in honey, like a name etched into wood behind. A wall no one thinks to check. And Josiah had never felt more powerful. It wasn't the preacher, not the overseer, not the merchant, nor the man who drank from silver cups. No, it was the child's bone that shattered the silence. A boy, no older than 3, had come to Middleton with his mother, a distant cousin of the mistress, visiting. from Charleston. Blonde curls, milk-white skin, a voice sharp enough to wake the dead. He was the kind of child white folks adored and slaves feared. Children like that could accuse, break, lie, and never pay a price. He chased chickens, crawled under tables, wandered through rooms. Then, one morning, he vanished. At first, they assumed he was hiding. He liked tricks under bed frames, inside crates. But as the sun dipped and the laughter faded into shouts, worry became panic. His mother screamed his name into the trees until her voice cracked. The master shouted, "Find him, or wish you were dead." The search lasted 2 days. Men combed fields, dogs sniffed dirt, barrels overturned, wells checked. Even the riverbanks were searched. On the third evening, as dusk thickened the air, a dog caught the scent near the smokehouse. The fire inside was low. Josiah had said he was rendering fat, saving bones for broth. No one questioned it. He was just the cook. But when the dog pawed at the coals, whimpering, they dug. They pulled out a bone short, pale, blackened at one end. Too small for any animal. A child's femur. The room froze. A scream broke the silence. No one knew whose. The search ended. Punishment began. Slaves were lined up, whipped in groups. No questions, just blows. Men bled before they could speak. Women were dragged from their beds. Babies were torn from mothers' arms, examined as if more bones might fall from their mouths. Josiah, though, was untouched. The cook, the master muttered, rubbing his temples. "He feeds us," he wouldn't. Josiah stood in the doorway, apron damp with broth, watching the chaos he hadn't caused, but had always known was coming. The beatings lasted 2 days. On the third morning, a field hand woke. Isaac, 16, thin, jittery, with a lash across his cheek. He hadn't meant to speak, but watching another boy scream cracked something inside. "Check the floorboards," he whispered. It was an oath. They dragged Josiah out, tore apart the pantry, sacks tossed, jars smashed. For a moment, nothing. Then, one of the house boys noticed a seam. A mismatched board behind the dry beans. Inside the hollow space. Jars, dozens. Powders of every color, green like rot, red like rust, gray like ash. Some labeled, some smudged. Dried herbs, carefully tied cloths, and a pouch of teeth. Human, molars and incisors. Roots charred. Behind it all. Names carved in wood. 27 names. Dates, doses, notes. Quick, boiled, delayed. Every name matched a guest who died. Reverend, overseer, neighbor. Forgotten names, until now. The master sat, trembling. The list shook in his hands. The mistress fainted. No one caught her. Josiah didn't run, didn't cry. When they surrounded him, torches raised, pistols drawn, he didn't plead. He stood beside the fire pit, hands at his sides, eyes fixed skyward. "Why?" someone asked. He turned, expression blank, his voice calm, like when offering pie. "I just fed them." He said, "Fed them like they fed us." The words hung like smoke. It was madness. It was truth. They chained him by sunset. But something shifted in those hours. The silence grew heavy. Servants avoided the kitchen. Some stopped eating. The fire pit was extinguished, rebuilt, Extinguished again. The smell wouldn't leave not. Smoke, but something deeper. Something metallic. Something human. The mistress never touched meat again. The master developed a tremor. No more guests. No more parties. Behind the wall, the list remained, 27 names in a steady hand. They hanged Josiah 2 days later. No judge. No preacher. No prayer. The noose waited beneath the same cypress where his father once swung. A crowd gathered, some curious, some ashamed. Josiah said nothing. Eyes distant, like he'd already left. But just before the rope touched his skin, he made one final request. Let me cook. Not a threat, not a plea. Just truth. The mistress screamed. The master hesitated, then nodded. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. Maybe he just knew Josiah's hands were still the surest in the house. He returned to the kitchen unchained. No guards. The fire was ready. His knives in place. He moved slowly, barefoot, deliberate. He cooked in silence. No measurements, no notes. Only memory. Fried corn cakes with golden crust. Smoked rabbit with sage. Syrup tea dark as ink. No poison, just food. The way it had been before. Grief taught his hands another recipe. He plated the meal. Set it on the table. Watched the steam curl. Then turned. Extended his wrists. Walked outside. They hanged him at sunset. The sky glowed orange. The crowd watched, waiting to feel something. Relief never came. Only the creak of rope. And the quiet shift of something. Ending. They buried him behind the kitchen. Not with the others. Alone. As if even in death, he was too dangerous. No marker. Just dirt. But the earth rejected him. By spring, it was dust. Chickens avoided it. Dogs howled passing by. One man swore he saw smoke rise from the grave at dawn. Another claimed he smelled roasting meat. The years passed. The kitchen never felt clean again. A fire pit collapsed. No cook stayed long. The laughter faded. And in 1872, the fire came. No lightning. No candle, just flames. Rising from nowhere. The house screamed. Walls cracked. Portraits blistered. By dawn, only ash. The story was a storm. God's will. But those who remembered Josiah knew better. Said he came back. Said he lit the flames. Himself. Log by log. Said he's still out there. In the ashes. In the wind. Still stirring. Still cooking. Still hungry. Not for food, but for justice. For memory. For the world to taste what it did to him. And until it does, that fire in his soul will never go out.